Well, yes, I do define myself as a European. Um, I was growing up in Siberia, in Russia, and identity was not a major thing at the time, but through the study of history as a school pupil and just positioning oneself in the geography of it all, having Siberia be surrounded by Asian nations, a question of whether Russians are Europeans, whether I'm European, and how did we get here arose at some point. And I think it was through the study of Russian history mostly that I came to the very easy conclusion that Russians are in fact part of Europe, uh, are in fact European, and this is the tradition, historical tradition, and political legacy of Russia is part of a larger European family. Through the time as I was studying in the university and started to travel westward and had the chance to travel to European Union, I think some of the details of the puzzle began to fall in a proper manner. Plus, obviously, through the study of political science and the study of democracy and understanding the specifics of Russian democracy and Russian history, I think the remaining questions were answered to the degree that Russia is, as I've said, is part of Europe, is a very unique, very interesting case. But I have no um, doubts that it is European. So am I. Well, I was growing up in late 90s, early 2000s, and the collapse of the Soviet Union was so fresh that the identity of the older generation was still Soviet in a sense, and they didn't quite figure out that they need to redefine who they are. I mean, to a certain extent, some of them still remain to be Soviet. Others do try to figure out their place in the world. For some of our neighbors in Central Asia, it was easier because they had their historic religious different other than Russian legacy to fall back on to redefine who they are. And part of being, especially in that region where you have China and you have Central Asian states nearby, and basically to the west you have United States and Canada. At some point, you had to question how you got there as a group, as ethnic group, historically how you got in the region, and what it has to do with Moscow and Moscow's imperial tradition, and what was the imperial tradition other than a very European feature. Well, I don't think there was like one particular moment. I think it was. I think history was the main component. I was really enjoyed studying history when I was growing up, when I was still in school, and I was studying history, and it was quite fascinating. And I don't think if history is being taught the very same way now as it was taught to me, but the huge component of studying Russian history in Russia is basically studying how Russia was moving westwards. And well, it was always kind of moving all over the map, but it was moving westwards in terms of acquiring technology, acquiring certain know-how, institutional practices to a certain degree, of course. And that was always fascinating. This search um, that it seemed like a huge search for a better solution on how to do things, and it was always coming from there. And there was one particular aspect that I think was the most fascinating about a medieval Russian concept of Moscow being the third Rome. Uh, and the idea was there to link Moscow to Byzantium, and Byzantium, of course, to Rome. And I think it was at that point that I realized that basically, well, if we are trying to get ourselves tied up with that part of the world so much, and this is basically the ultimate goal to somehow make oneself close to Rome, then the Roman Greek history and the entire ancient world is part of our history as well. And and again, then through studying the Roman legacy in medieval Western Europe, and through studying trying at least to understand how it affected the Moscow state, it seemed to me that well, look, this is a version of reality that is not accepted by everyone, even in Russia, and mostly not in certain, maybe not as certainly in Western Europe. But I think through the study of history, even when I was still a kid, that was the time that I was kind of shifting towards seeing that as part of my own identity. But it hit me for the first time, I think, in 2010. It was the first time I visited EU. It was Germany, and it didn't feel strange. It felt, well, like it was supposed to be that way. Like this is something I understand, and the people who were there from all over EU were quite quite friendly and quite the same in many ways. And I think that was the moment of personal connection with people from the EU, people from Western Europe, that built and kind of made that feeling complete, feeling oneself European. I think like I have three, depending on how we frame it, I have three particular moments. One being, of course, if we're talking about a couple of centuries, that would be the Second World War, the Holocaust, and I think that one is quite clear, understandable, a terrible moment for the entire world, but for Europe especially. If we were to define the recent history as most people in Eastern Europe would define it as after the fall of the Soviet Union, I would say that would be 2014 and the war in Ukraine. Something was considered absolutely impossible before, uh, death of thousands of people, a conflict that is still going on. And I think it was a huge personal trauma to, um, well, for me, it was a huge moment, but I think it was a huge personal trauma for a lot of people in Eastern Europe in general. And if we to define recent history as very recent history, then I would say Brexit was a moment of utter foolishness and a mistake that is going to be quite costly, but hopefully it will be a lesson, and Europe will learn how to talk to its people, and how to explain what the European Union is, and why being part of it is much better than short-term, vague, populist goals. Like the creation of the European Union, and probably the expansion of all four, including the Baltic states, kind of this huge step to unite Europe. A lot of symbolism there, a lot of promise, um, and generally that it did bring a lot of prosperity, and um, a lot of people that haven't traveled EU would not know how successful it is in terms of connecting very different places like Norway and Spain, or Bulgaria and Ireland, in one single organism, no borders, most of the time one currency, one market, and no war, which is the most important of it. I think it was this is probably the best moment in the last thousand years in the European history. First and by most that there was no war in this particular part of Europe, which unfortunately does not speak for the entire Europe, at least in the way that I define Europe. So the EU has an office in Moscow. I think it is called the EU delegation to Russia. And back in 2010, I attended a seminar organized by that very institution. It's kind of your top class civic enlightenment seminars on the world, generally a bit on the European Union and its institutions, current policy, economics. And that seminar in particular was a very important step for me in, well, first of all, figuring out how things work in terms of economics, politics, but it did bring a lot of opportunities in terms of networking and feeling more connected to the rest of the world. As I've said, I'm from Siberia, from Novosibirsk. It is a big city, but it is far away from everything imaginable. So having that connection right there with the European Union and people from it was very important and was very inspiring, and it kind of led to a lot of very interesting friendships and professional partnerships that helped me out in the last 15 years. Well, slightly less, but still 10 years. So I would
So,
say the EU outreach to Russia, that is the best thing that EU has done for me. I would greatly appreciate, and I think it would be quite important for EU to have a very ambitious new idea of what it could be. I think part of the problem with the EU today is that it kind of stopped dreaming big. I do understand the crisis here and the crisis there, but I think EU is not only a bureaucratic institution, and it is sort of a vision of Europe free and whole. And I think the way we kind of stopped now, it prohibits EU from developing further in the future. And having an ambitious plan for what Europe should be or could be, I think is something that will definitely drive the development of both economically and politically of forces surrounding European Union today. And it would hopefully stimulate the internal development of EU for various pragmatic reasons as well, such as markets and trade. But having an ambitious vision with some creative institutional form of cooperation in 2030 that would encompass countries that are currently part of Council of Europe would be a tremendous achievement. It doesn't have to be all part of the EU, as I've said. It could be a very creative solution, but the EU has to announce that it's not it. The current borders are not the way that Europe is, and the rest is non-Europe. Europe has to take charge and take the lead and say that, well, we do consider all of you currently out of EU part of one big Europe. 2030 is the time frame that I think might not be exactly what I have in mind, because it's too soon to a certain degree, but I believe that European Union has to have an ambitious policy towards its neighborhood that has to be ambitious and has to be creative and has to learn from the mistakes of the previous decade, Eastern Partnership not being maybe all that successful on many fronts. But European Union as an institutional body today has to invest more in its foreign policy capability, power projection, soft power tools that are existent. And there are enough resources to actually uh, to do more generally. Because the way I see it, as soon as the EU stops and says that the current borders are where our interests end, it doesn't end well for the ones outside of EU for various reasons. In terms of the kind of the ideal Europe, or the Europe of the dream, I don't think the institutional frame is necessarily the most important question here, but I do believe that the ideal Europe is Europe of many different agents, and well, Russia definitely being part of that group. And for political reasons today, this is not feasible, but this is something that should exist as an alternative, as a concept, as an idea for the 21st century. Because without having this idea, we are ending up with the possibility of literally millions, dozens of millions of Europeans heading heading away from Europe politically, economically, socially, and this is not going to end well for the EU and for these nations for sure. Look, I think we are looking at a particular turning point, but it's not necessarily a turning point that makes Putin weaker or his rule in Russia more questionable. I think we're looking at a turning point where there are almost no more carrots for domestic policy, and we'll definitely see more stick in the way the Kremlin is governing Russia. That we'll see uh, less less attempts to imitate democracy in any form or any way, more ways, and we'll see more clearly defined by the book authoritarian practices. And basically, all of this is required to maintain Putin in the office and the ruling elites, economic and political, to maintain their positions. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing a huge social political movement that is capable of challenging Putin's rule in Russia instantly. And his rule might be um, prolonged until the early 30s at least. I think the key feature that we have to keep in mind regarding Navalny protests that there are roughly 20% of people in Russia that support Navalny as a political figure. There are a lot more who support the protests for various reasons, and economic concerns being there a very huge segment. Uh, but I do see that the state has enormous capacity to project violence, to project power, and a lack of positive experiences. Look, if one has to, one does not have to look any further than Belarus, and we've seen last summer thousands, hundreds of thousands people go on the street, taking to the streets, marching for weeks on and on and on, and not actually seeing any major change except for some moral victories. And this experience is definitely discouraging for those Russians who do want to take it to the streets and do want to see Putin out of the office. But as it currently stands, there are no positive cases, and there's still a lot of resources for the Kremlin to maintain the socioeconomic situation rather stable. if we look at the polls, Putin's rating fell by 2-3%, no more than that actually. So the way the pandemic was enveloping in Russia was that majority of people would rather blame each other for the spread of the virus than the ineffectiveness of the government. A very interesting. Another specific was that after the first wave and certain lockdown, people were so happy that in the second wave, this similar harsh lockdown didn't happen, that it actually took a little bit of heat off the government. Now, with the development of the vaccine and the prospects of the economy, for the economy to recover and for the economy to be reopened, we actually might be witnessing, I would not be surprised, a certain rise in Putin's rating. Well, I think um, the populists across the globe, what they do and what they will continue doing is adapting certain tactics used by the Kremlin, certain technical features of, say, how to make your media more compliant, say imposing some weird taxes as it is happening now in Poland, uh, making it very hard for businesses to support independent media, making all sorts of kind of shady schemes for businessmen close to power controlling that media, if we're talking about media. But generally, I think there's a certain point of Putin's progression towards authoritarianism or within authoritarianism, that some of those practices would not be suitable even for Hungary or Poland because there are certain institutional limitations that do still exist. And the EU is sort of supposed to make sure that those lines are not crossed, and the Poles and the Hungarians actually should do the same. And the more Putin moves towards suppressing the protests with violence, I think the less attractive his model is, would be for Poland, Hungary, or any other state that would like to emulate those policies. And if we're talking about the way to tackle those issues and how to limit, say, Putin's or Russia's or Kremlin's rather capabilities of influencing uh, democracies of European Union is, well, basically to tackle domestic concerns that actually allow those populists to come to power and exploit those domestic problems. I mean, there's nothing that is exported or is imported rather from Russia that it was not already existing in the countries where Russian interference or Russian influence is seen today or could be seen tomorrow. Russia has always been fixated with the West and particularly with Europe. I mean, if one would take a few hours of their time to just watch Russian TV, most of the time you would only hear about Europe's problems. It is a sort of obsession, really. But this is the only kind of Russian love that truly stands as the one with the West. Russia's relationship with China is purely pragmatic. There is no uh, sentiment within the society or the elites to actually go eastwards and adapt Eastern practices or norms. So Russia doesn't actually have any long-term strategy or any long-term vision for a greater Asia. So the only movement, the only real option after Putin would be to reestablish relationship with the West to work on the problems that have existed, and European Union, of course, would be here in the forefront. For economic, for political, for social reasons, this is the only viable option. And even if the next leader after Putin comes from his own cabinet, he would not have an alternative other than to try to work it out with the West. It did happen in Russian history already many times. It's going to happen again. If we're talking about feelings, this is love. This is definitely love. It is the feeling of one being rejected, Russia, of course, here, and being angry and confused at times, and just sad that the West or Europe in this particular case does not recognize it is equal, does not recognize it as, or does not love back in return. And I think it doesn't go back to 89, it goes back to at least 18th century. It is the returning story. Hate is a function of love. So what we're seeing now is basically the same feeling, and the sort of hate towards the Europe and European values, European institutions is just being instrumentalized for domestic purposes, for trying to do the very same thing the rest of the political apparatus is trying to accomplish, to make Putin stay in power for as long as possible, safe as possible. And today, it so happens that this is the option to show that there's no alternative there. It is all decay, demise, and very hostile values to the Russian soul or Russian people. And this propaganda is something that the majority of people would not actually believe in or believe only partially, but it does not actually penetrate deep enough. But still, the main point here is that Russia keeps looking at the West, whether it as in the early 1990s when it was kind of full of love and aspiration and trying to emulate the institution and practices and full of hope. But then it was the same object. It's still the same West that Russia is looking at, but now the feelings have changed. It's more of resentment and hate, but it essentially has never changed its orientation. It never pivoted to the east. It's not looking at Beijing. It's not looking at China. It still looks at the West, but it's just kind of the mood is a bit different. But there's nothing organic about the hate towards the West that you could see now in Russia. It's a pure politically driven creation. I think EU's options are quite limited, especially when it comes to Russian domestic situation. But there is certainly one message that the EU could send that would be seen and heard pretty clear. If countering the Russian official narrative that EU is very different and is essentially hostile in the end towards Russia and towards Russian um, political and social construct, the EU could do the opposite and, for instance, say, well, from now on, you guys can enter here visa free. We are happy to see you. We consider you kind of part of the same cultural, historic space. It doesn't have to be like all Russians. It could be the younger generation of Russians, say Russians under 30, but a gesture of goodwill towards the people, not towards the Kremlin, but towards the people, would be a very interesting, unexpected signal that would be impossible to counter, really. Because it is easy now to say that, look, they don't want you there, they don't want you being part of whatever the Europe could be, and it is hard for you to get there, and they don't really care about what happens in Russia. So doing the opposite, showing that Europe does care what happens to the Russian civil society, to the Russian people, and extending this offer better packed along with some sweet, interesting programs for people to visit, to do cultural exchange, and to invest in people-to-people relationship would be the best long-term strategy, or rather medium-term strategy that you could do towards Russia now. If we remember, it has been an issue for about 10 years for the official Kremlin narrative that, look, the EU does not want to have decent relationship with us because they are they're not doing anything about visa regime. They're always stalling the process. We are ready, and they don't want us. And that is that's the message they're sending towards all the Russians. We don't really want you here. So doing the opposite would destroy this narrative. I think he is a politician that is evolving. Certainly 10, 12 years ago, he was more to the right side, and he was in fact a nationalist. But I've been following his political evolution, and I think he is, well, first of all, adapting to the situation and to the desires of the majority. So he is in fact a populist, but I don't actually see that as some horrible feature of a politician in Russia who's trying to challenge Vladimir Putin, the biggest um, populist in the country. Um, he's not a pro-European Democrat. He does not have a European, as in pro-EU or pro-Western agenda. So he's sort of pro-Russian, I think, in the sense that he's trying to frame himself, his political goals and his political program. He does, however, I think, has a very I would say balanced approach towards foreign policy, where he pretty much says that, well, Russia is supposed to be friends with whoever wants to be friends with us. Uh, but considering what he is trying to accomplish in terms of institutional building, considering what he's trying to accomplish in terms of kind of election, electoral procedures, and many other aspects, it would essentially bring Russia closer to Europe, the EU in its institutional design, and Russia being more democratic would definitely be a Russia that has better relations with the European Union. So in that sense, he is in fact pro-European, but waving EU flag in Russia today is something that would never grant you any additional political points. It would rather subtract a few dozen. So he's not ideal, he's not perfect, but it is impossible to be perfect, but he's the one that has the political determination, vigor to attempt to symbolically at least challenge Putin, which he does. And he's the one that was able to acquire very impressive political infrastructure in the country where political opposition is a crime. Active political opposition is a crime. It's a hard one. I don't know. I mean, clearly, if that was to happen, it would have been a very important historic moment for for the opposition towards the regime, and the change would have been inevitable, and this would have been a very defining feature of the protests against Putin. But I would not go as far as to say that it would actually mean a change today or tomorrow. Still, we've already had um, well, an opposition figure, Boris Nemtsov, being assassinated in 2015. It did lead to a number of marches. It did lead to a certain consolidation of the opposition movement, but I don't think he's yet that popular. He's not nationwide adored to be that kind of political figure yet. But again, Kremlin isn't stupid. It would not create uh, I would think it would not create this additional kind of pressure, this additional weight on itself, because they're still trying to actively denying every allegation and saying that they have nothing to do with the poisoning or any other unlawful, unjust activities.